constitutes the term good graphics? I've seen this term bandied around frequently in video game journalism over the years, and it's always been difficult to pinpoint exactly what this phrase means. Talk of graphics is a constant fixture of tech demos, console launches, and game announcements, and much like a new physics engine, games whose graphics render life in a more realistic fashion than ever before attempted are frequently cited as industry game changers. However, to describe good graphics as those that render life the most accurately would be an oversimplification. And over the past few years there has been an increasing move away from hyperrealism towards a more stylized form of graphical representation. I don't think that this is purely a coincidence, however, and across this video I will be tracing the history of graphics and argue that this move towards hyper-stylization may be the result of graphics moving too close towards realism to the point that they are becoming disorientating, or more specifically, uncanny. Early games such as Tennis for Two were composed entirely of dots and lines, which were rendered using a cathode ray tube. Back then this wasn't a stylised choice, but necessity. But as computers became more sophisticated during the 1970s, video games were still largely represented with simple two-dimensional shapes, even if they were being used to represent more complex characters such as ships, bombs, or a paddle and ball, as in the famous 1972 game Pong. There was something oddly endearing about seeing complex structures rendered in simplistic geometric forms, and this principle guided the development of video games for the next 2 decades. Even when the first attempts at 3D graphics were pursued, pioneered on consoles such as the SNES, they were actually a two-dimensional illusion, guided by the same principles as their forebearers. This is best illustrated by the 1992 game Super Mario Kart, where the kart pretty much stays still in the centre of the frame and the backgrounds move on a 2D plane, creating the illusion that the kart is moving forwards on a 3-dimensional road. Likewise, whilst 1993's Star Fox utilised partial polygonal 3D graphics, many of the textures present in the game were still fundamentally flat and 2-dimensional. Simply put, true graphics required consoles which were far more powerful than the SNES or Mega Drive, and it wasn't until the next generation of consoles that true 3D was possible. Games such as Super Mario 64, innovative for its use of a 3-dimensional camera, utilised polygonal shapes to render a truly 3D gaming experience. Polygons were the multi-sided shapes which were used to construct anything on screen. The more polygons, the less jaggedy the edges would look, and the more realistic these characters would come across. But even with games such as Doom, Banjo-Kazooie, and The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time becoming huge successes with 3D graphics, video games had yet to come anywhere near the Uncanny Valley, which is perhaps where we find ourselves today. If you've ever wondered why video games used to be full of animal mascots, it's partly because they were easier to represent graphically than humans. A cartoon blue hedgehog was simpler to draw and see on a screen than a burly man in a trench coat. Simple shapes which can be instantly recognised as a character, such as a bright green dinosaur, a la Yoshi, or a purple dragon like Spyro, were much easier to recognise and render on a small screen with few polygons to work with. Given the technological limitations, it isn't surprising that video games were full of colourful animals with unusual and exaggerated body types. Whilst games such as GoldenEye utilised what could be called, at the time, realistic graphics, there was never really any argument to be made that these characters looked at all like accurate representations of human bodies. But as technology developed further, there seemed to be an increasing emphasis placed upon graphics acting as realistic representations of the outside world. With the dawn of the 7th generation of consoles, we were seeing more and more games whose press releases were bandying about how realistic their graphics looked. An obvious example is 2007's Crysis, whose graphics required so much computer power to render at maximum resolution that it even spawned a meme. But ignoring a graphical juggernaut like Crysis, some of the biggest releases of the mid to late 2000s and early 2010s were games which had a basis in reality. Games such as GTA 4, the Assassin's Creed series, and Battlefield have shown that humans could look reasonably realistic on screen. They were attempting and getting closer and closer to photorealism, which appeared to be the ultimate goal. In theory, this should make games more immersive than ever. Science fiction is obsessed with this idea of totally immersive, augmented reality, and the long-term goal of VR projects like the Oculus Rift is to create an entertainment system that provides the ultimate form of escapism. But there is something about photorealistic graphics, or rather, graphics that are close to being photorealistic, that seems, well, off. In 2011, Rockstar released the action-adventure game LA Noire, in which you must take on the role of a detective and solve crimes, interrogating subjects and figuring out if they are lying or telling the truth. The game was relatively well received by critics and even received praise for its advances in facial animation technology. And yet many gamers found the game's graphics disconcerting. Whilst the technological innovations of LA Noire allowed it to be theoretically one of the most realistic games ever, it also meant that the game fell victim to one of the most problematic elements of photorealism, the Uncanny Valley. The Uncanny Valley is an expression to explain the feeling of unease or discomfort which comes from a simulation of a human approaching realism, but not quite succeeding in looking like a human. The concept was initially identified by the robotics professor Masahiro Mori. Mori observed that as robots were given more human features, people became more positive and empathetic towards these robots. But this was up to a certain point, past which people felt uneasy. This phenomenon is believed to occur because humans are very good at seeing faces and human attributes in images. Take the number of crisps that are claimed to look like Jesus or any other famous figure, or the fact that two dots and a line immediately makes us see a smiley face. However, we are also really good at seeing when something is wrong. Since humans spend a lot of time looking at faces and reading social cues and emotions from them, we can easily identify if something isn't quite right. This clip of a Japanese robot used to train dental students is really creepy, yet she looks quite a lot like a human. Her eyes, mouth, nose and face are all there. But immediately, she can still be identified as not human, which makes us feel uneasy. This sense of unease, or at least a weird form of unrealism, was displayed in LA Noire. The characters were attempting to be very human, but ended up looking less human than an Italian plumber with a nose 40% the size of his head. Simulation of life, seen in war games such as the Call of Duty series, or sports games such as FIFA or Madden, have embodied the pursuit of realism. However, as graphical fidelity is improved, so has the risk of falling into the Uncanny Valley. As the protagonists got more realistic, so did they have the chance of looking less human. The more effort and money that got poured into making a character look real, it was easier for people to spot the mistakes. Somehow humans are much better at spotting small mistakes when the rest of the piece looks so good. The 2013 Tomb Raider reboot of the series was considered a financial failure by Square Enix, its publisher, after it only sold 3.4 million copies. This is somewhat speculative, but that failure was driven by high sales expectations due to a costly development cycle. The development was costly because of the high level of graphical fidelity. The new Lara Croft was designed to look like a real person, and she does look pretty damn real. I remember when this game was being released and everyone was talking about TressFX, the world's first real-time hair rendering technology in a playable game. And that was great, but it also cost the studio a huge amount of money. In order to avoid the Uncanny Valley, graphical fidelity needs to be of the very highest level and therefore costs a lot. The rising cost of AAA video games has been a big topic in the industry, and much of that cost is involved in making the game look good, look realistic. Kotaku's article regarding why video games cost so much to make put a ballpark figure of $10,000 per month per person working on a video game, which is pretty steep, and escalates a lot when you're working with more polygons and higher graphical fidelity, of course. I'm sure the designers at BioWare are now fully aware of the importance of getting facial features right after the release of Mass Effect Andromeda. This leaves video game developers with two options. One, you can pump loads of money into your game and make it look as real as possible in an attempt to jump over the Uncanny Valley, or two, you can stop aiming for realism altogether. The growth of stylized graphics has stemmed largely from the growth of indie darlings, who on a smaller budget have sought to make their games look cool and distinct without breaking the bank. In 2012, the indie game Journey won many Game of the Year awards, and much of the praise revolved around its beautiful art style. The art style of games like Journey, Braid, Limbo, and even Minecraft were unique, distinctive, and cheaper than the realistic-looking Battlefield or Forza. Games such as Team Fortress 2 and Gearbox Software's Borderlands pioneered stylized graphics, with Borderlands being responsible for the appeal of cel-shaded artwork, and Team Fortress 2 proving that you don't need to look hyper-realistic to garner a hardcore gaming audience. The distinctive and immediately identifiable nature of more unique and stylized art in games was also a goldmine for those in the marketing departments, as this meant it was much easier to sell merchandise and create a clear brand image. Think about how Minecraft has been able to sell so much merchandise, like this toy cuddly pig. It doesn't look realistic, but you know it's a pig because of the colours and the basic shape. Fortnite has garnered much praise for its fun and carefree aesthetic. The characters can dance and emote, they have unrealistic proportions with bright colours, wacky costumes, and even a flying bus. The artists at Epic Games aren't trying to make Fortnite look like a real gritty battlefield, and this has resulted in a cheaper game where the characters are nowhere near the Uncanny Valley. The slightly comic book aesthetic has allowed them to avoid the Uncanny Valley and embrace the trend of stylish, unique, and relatively cheaper graphics. The appeal of stylish and cartoonish graphics, such as those in Fortnite, aren't just convenient for video game developers, it's something that they have worked to improve and make appealing. The beauty of video games is that they can simulate any experience or any world our minds can conceive. However, making that world look entirely photorealistic is incredibly expensive. And when it involves humans, it risks falling into the Uncanny Valley if you don't throw enough money at it. A cheaper and often more desirable solution is to create a unique and playful artistic direction, giving you brand recognition and also perhaps pushing the boundaries of what we can imagine. We've all played a game where we sit in a trench and shoot baddies who look pretty real, but maybe we'd rather play a shooty game where we ride a shopping trolley and jump out of a flying bus. And really, maybe it's better that falling from a parachute jump doesn't look too realistic. Thank you so much for watching our video. If you'd like to see more from Full Fat Videos, please don't forget to like, share and subscribe. You can see our social media links down below if you want to follow us on things like Twitter. And thank you very much to all our patrons. If you would like to join our Patreon, the link is in the description. We will see you next week.